in China, there's also something that which they call content-based e-commerce or interest-based e-commerce, where you sort of, for instance, are scrolling through videos in Douyin, the Chinese version of TikTok, and you come across a very interesting short video or a live stream where sort of influencers are selling products. That results in much more impulsive buying. And what is of course very important is that these platforms know how to serve the right short videos and the right live streams to you, so that you actually have conversion, so that you actually end up impulse buying these goods.
Welcome to the European Guanxi Podcast. My name is Leon Bakel, member of European Guanxi, and today we're having Ed Sander, analyst of China's tech landscape at TechBuzz China. Ed, you just came back from China. Welcome at the European Guanxi Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here, and today we were talking about Temu and tariffs, some topics that you've been writing and speaking extensively about lately.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Your recent trip to China was organizing a study trip on China's e-commerce. Could you tell us a bit more about e-commerce in China, and why should we learn more about it?
Yeah. Well, basically, I do three different things. First of all, I'm an analyst for TechBuzz China, as you said, and for TechBuzz, I write a in-depth report every month, which is mostly about Chinese internet companies and specifically also about e-commerce in China, but also e-commerce coming from China to American, European markets. The second thing is that I do keynotes. The insights that I gain from the research for TechBuzz China, I share in keynotes for companies, seminars, etc., etc. And that basically resulted in setting up study tours where I take mostly people active in retail and e-commerce from Europe to China. And what we do then is we combine masterclasses that I give in the morning, which is basically a more elaborate version of the keynotes that I do about these topics, with actual company visits and store visits in the afternoon. So people get the basically the theory in the morning, and in the afternoon they get the real experience. So they see both sides. This, of course, is extremely interesting for the people that come with us, because e-commerce in China has really exploded in the last 15 years. And there are business models in China that you won't come across in Europe or in America. So there's a lot to learn. Not everything can easily be copied to our own markets, but you can at least be inspired. And maybe even more important, you can start to understand why these things happen in China, why they emerge. And it's very important competitive intelligence as well, because a lot of these companies are now, like I said, they're coming to our markets. So we should be prepared and we should be more knowledgeable about their business model. So that's basically what I do. So, well, basically, e-commerce, to say it simply, is online shopping. People buying goods online. Whereas in China, it's also, you could be buying something online and you could have it delivered offline from an actual store. So one of the things that makes e-commerce in China very interesting is that in the West, we still tend to buy most of the things in web shops, traditional e-commerce web shops like Amazon. And what they do is what in China is called shelf commerce. So you actually have a purchase intention and you go into these stores to search for that product, and then you find it and you buy it. But in China, there's also something that which they call content-based e-commerce or interest-based e-commerce, where you sort of, for instance, are scrolling through videos in Douyin, the Chinese version of TikTok, and you come across a very interesting short video or a live stream where sort of influencers are selling products. That results in much more impulsive buying. And what is of course very important is that these platforms know how to serve the right short videos and the right live streams to you, so that you actually have conversion, so that you actually end up impulse buying these goods. And that is something that is now also coming to the West, because TikTok Shop is launching in many different countries. Other platforms like Amazon and TikTok and Facebook also have tried live commerce. They've never really been very successful because they didn't have the right success factors, as we see in China, like good hosts, good seamless integration within the app, You should have a very good offer. You should have good interaction and sort of FOMO, fear of missing out. So most of the platforms in the West haven't been very successful in doing that. Now, on top of these things, we've also seen the emergence of different forms of e-commerce. Like in recent years, there's been an explosion of instant retail. Instant retail is basically where you go into an app, could be Taobao, Ele.me, or it could be Meituan Shangou, where you search for a product, but it's delivered from a store or a dark store, a so-called front-end warehouse, very close to where you live. Normally, in a radius of 5 kilometers around where you live, you will see that location based in the apps. And what that means is both for non-food, but also for groceries, you could order something and have it delivered within about half an hour. So this is also starting to cannibalize more traditional e-commerce. Now, there's many different big companies that are doing different forms of e-commerce in China. You have the traditional ones like Jingdong, JD.com, and you have Alibaba with Tmall and Taobao. And then you have Meituan and Ele.me, also part of Alibaba, that are doing instant retail. You have Taobao also doing live commerce, selling in live streams. But also you see that companies like Douyin, the Chinese TikTok, but also Kuaishou are also doing live commerce. So the landscape is completely different from what we see normally in Europe and in the US, because all of the platforms that we use in our markets are basically, they failed or are not available for several reasons in the Chinese market. So learning from these platforms, learning from these business models and these new forms of e-commerce that are, like I said, also coming to our markets by Chinese competitors is something that is, I think, highly interesting.
So you talked about these innovative forms of e-commerce in China, and basically people are buying relatively cheap goods online. And in Europe, we have been buying cheap goods from China for quite a while now. What makes the current situation different?
Yeah. So if we take two examples, for instance, live commerce. Um, Live commerce will never, that's my theory, will never be as big in Europe as, for instance, in China. Because in China, it's like 30% of all e-commerce sales, online sales, happen in a live stream. And e-commerce is about 30% of the total retail market. So that means that about 9% of everything that is sold in China is sold in an online live stream. I don't think that it will ever be as big in Europe because of cultural factors, but also because of the willingness of influencers to live stream for hour and hour and hour per day. They much more prefer to actually make a short video and get paid very well by a brand than doing live streams 4 hours a day. Also, a lot of brands don't are not willing to give the high discounts that you normally see in live streams in China. So while a company like TikTok with TikTok Shop will be able to make live commerce popular in the West, I don't think it will reach the same heights as we see in China. Nevertheless, it's a very interesting form to learn from because it will eventually capture part of the market. Now, the other thing I mentioned is instant retail, buying something in an app and getting it delivered from a store or a dark store warehouse near you. That's also quite difficult in most of the European countries. The reason is that in China, as you know, people basically live vertically. They live in these xiaoju, these communities that might have 10 or more very tall apartment building flats, and every apartment building could have like 25 floors and numerous different apartments. So there's thousands and thousands of people just living in one of those xiaoju communities. So that means that the density of population in the cities, in the big cities of China, is extremely high. We don't tend to see that in most of the European cities because Europeans tend to live in houses. They live horizontally. So that means that in a radius, like I was talking about the radius of 5 kilometers around a store, there will be fewer people living there than when you do that in certain residential areas in China. So that means that it is much more difficult to get that model profitable. And we've seen a lot of the companies that tried this, like Gorillas and Getir and Zap. They have failed in the European market uh, because it's much more difficult to get a return on investment on that in European markets because of the lower density. So again, it's not possible to copy everything from China, but at the same time, you see that some of these Chinese companies that are active in these forms of e-commerce, they will also sometimes try different things. So take, for instance, Meituan. Meituan is doing meal delivery, but they are also doing instant retail. And they have started to do meal delivery and instant retail in certain companies in the Middle East, like in Abu Dhabi, in Saudi Arabia. So they are expanding outside the Chinese market as well.
Okay, so we see how these companies start to expand about outside of China as well. From a European perspective, we have first seen Alibaba, we've also seen Shein, and now Temu. What distinguishes these companies and what makes them different from each other? And yeah, what is different in their business models and why are they so successful?
So if we take two examples, Shein and Temu, one of the big advantages of these companies is their direct integration into the supply chain in China. If you take, for instance, Shein, they work together with a few thousand textile manufacturers, so apparel manufacturers. They make clothing products mostly. And they have about maybe 300 or 400 like core suppliers that they have a very strong cooperation with. By working together with these suppliers, they can also get like low prices. And at the same time, what Shein is doing is they are constantly launching new designs. So basically, every day they launch about 2,000 new designs, which they then have manufactured by their partner suppliers in a very limited quantity, like maybe only like 100 or 200 pieces. They launch the product on the website, and depending on if the product turns out to be popular or not with the Shein buyers, the consumers that shop on Shein, they will either not reorder that product from the supplier or they will reorder it. And if they reorder it, basically in small batches, they continue to order that popular product until sort of it ceases to be popular, and then they will have new designs. So about 50% of the designs that they launch, they actually reorder. So, and they are able to do this because they are very agile, they're very fast. They use AI also to help them to create some of the designs. They also have a lot of people that sort of scan the internet and comb the internet for the latest trends. And because of the integration with that supply chain, they are able to do this. And then they basically send it around the world in airplanes. So this is another aspect that we'll probably be talking about later. So if you look at Temu, on the other hand, Temu is a cross-border platform by a company called Pinduoduo in China. And this company has since 2016 been extremely successful with a model that's called C2M, consumer to manufacturer. So basically what you do in that model, instead of having a manufacturer produce a certain product and try to push it through the value chain, through wholesale and through retail to the consumer, you basically turn it around. You have a limited number of SKUs, a limited number of products, and you sort of aggregate by gamification, by group buying, by different marketing tricks. You aggregate a lot of demand, and then basically you have a very high volume that the manufacturers can produce, therefore, because of economies of scale at a very low cost. So that's the C2M model. And Pinduoduo has been so successful with that model that they've actually captured 20% of the market share that used to be part of Alibaba's business. Alibaba, between 2013 and 25, they basically went down from 80% market share to about 40%, 45% market share in China. And they mostly lost that to Pinduoduo with their C2M model and to Douyin and Kuaishou with their live streams and short video model and their interest-based, content-based model that I talked about earlier. So it's a very successful company. They had a very successful IPO, and they were building up enormous cash reserves. And what they decided to do, because they started to stagnate as far as new customers, acquisition of new customers is concerned in China, they decided to go abroad. And that's why they launched Temu in September 2022. Now, what they did is they use some of the manufacturers that they already were working with their Pinduoduo platform to also select some products that they thought might be successful in Western markets as well, and then offer that in their app at extremely low prices and ship it by airplanes and small packages around the world. And then normally it would arrive at your doorstep in about 10 days. Now, the thing is that they can offer really low prices because they can provide such high volumes to these manufacturers. At the same time, what they are doing is they are subsidizing the shipping costs, because the shipping costs are an extremely large part of their cost structure. It's about like 27% of the total cost that they have, or basically the product price is being paid for logistics. And on average, they pay about $9 to ship an order around the world. So they're actually, in that model of packages that go in airplanes, they are losing money. But they are subsidizing that, and with they, I mean Pinduoduo, the parent company, not the Chinese government, as some people think, because they are buying market share. And after a while, they will change their business model to start shipping from local warehouses, and thereby then increasing their profitability. Now, this company, this platform, Temu, that launched in September 2022, is expected to be profitable by the end of this year, or at least next year, by constantly being agile and changing their business model. So these are two different examples where the main advantage, the main strength is based on the supply chain integration that they have in China, and thereby being able to offer millions of different SKUs, millions of different products at very low prices, which appeals to the consumers in Western markets.
All right, so we're dealing with integrated supply chains, highly innovative business models. And also in the USA, we see that perhaps Amazon is a bit struggling, and now we have Trump trying to curb these companies. For example, we have seen earlier this year with the Gulf of Tariffs that he also planned to remove the de minimis rule. So we have those tensions across the pond. Can you perhaps tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, basically, the thing is that because it's not just price, it's also, like you said, it's the business model that they use. Uh, I don't think that we'll ever be able, that any e-commerce company in Europe or in the US will ever be able to beat a company like Temu on price. And we also have to remember that if you look at Amazon, where the prices can also be quite low, even though Temu tends to be like 10-20% cheaper than Amazon, then about 50% of all products that are being sold on Amazon are also Chinese merchants using the Amazon platform to sell to Western consumers. So on the one hand, that Temu and Shein are not completely new. This is something that Amazon also has started doing about 10 years ago. So the only difference is that for merchants that want to sell to, for instance, in the US, consumers on Amazon Prime, the product has to be available in an Amazon fulfillment by Amazon warehouse. And that, together with the fact that merchants need to pay for visibility through advertising on Amazon, makes it more expensive for a lot of Chinese merchants to sell on Amazon than on Temu. Also, what Temu does, which is very attractive to a lot of manufacturers in China, is they have a model that they call the fully managed model. So basically it means that a manufacturer quotes sort of like a wholesale price to Temu. Then if Temu agrees with that wholesale price, they allow the manufacturer to put the goods in a Temu warehouse without Temu ever being the owner of the products. They don't buy these products. They're not a reseller. But they will then sell the products on the Temu platform, where they decide the consumer's price. They will do the marketing. they will do all of the logistics, and the manufacturer doesn't have to worry about this. So especially for a lot of factories that don't have the skills and the knowledge to do cross-border e-commerce, like the merchants that are already selling on Amazon, this is a very attractive business model, because the only thing they have to do is to make a few SKUs at a high volume at very low price and hand them over to Temu, where Temu basically has the consignment to sell it on their behalf. So now with the changes that are happening, where, like you said, the legislators and the authorities in different markets are, for instance, canceling the de minimis rules. Now, the de minimis rules is basically an import tax exemption, which was $800 in the US, and it's still €150 in Europe. If you if your package is below that value, then you don't have to pay any import tax. Well, that's an advantage for these companies. I don't think that it will be the only advantage that they have. So my theory is that when these things disappear, it won't stop these companies. It will make their prices a little higher, but it won't stop them. Now, what these companies are doing, especially Temu, is when they see these things happening. Now, take, for instance, the EU. Temu launched in the EU in 2023, April 2023. And after a few months, people started to worry a bit. Retailers started to complain a bit, rightfully so. And in 2024, the European Union started talking about, well, maybe we should get rid of that de minimis tax exemption and have these companies also pay import taxes below €150 order value. So this is something that started to be discussed in 2024 with the plan to implement it in 2028. The same thing happened in the US, but a lot faster. Now, when Temu sees this happening, they already anticipate what will happen down the lane, and they change their business model. So what Temu has started doing, both in the US but also in Europe already, is implement what they call a semi-managed model, where basically they say to the merchants or the factories, you know what, instead of sending it to our warehouse in Guangdong province in China, why don't you send it to a local warehouse in Europe or in the US? And this is a list of different warehouses that we approved that you can use. And then you're also responsible for shipping it to the consumer. So basically they hand over the logistics to the seller, the merchant. Now, the thing is that lowers their logistical costs, but it also speeds up the delivery time. So instead of waiting for a package for 2 weeks, consumers can get it in maybe 3 days from a local warehouse. They are also able to ship different products that don't fit in a small package that has to go into an airplane. So they started selling furniture. They even started selling excavators in the US and movable houses. So very bulky, large products. So, and maybe most important of all, they anticipate in the cancellation of the de minimis, because by the time the de minimis is cancelled, for instance, in the US, they ship about 80% of the goods already from local warehouses, and they aim to do the same thing in Europe. So it's this anticipation and relatively slow change of legislation in Western markets that just make these Chinese companies a lot faster than compared to the speed in which we respond to their business.
Due to environmental and economical concerns, we also see those in Europe. More and more politicians are seeking ways to curb these business models and to curb these companies' influence. What are effective ways to decrease the power of such companies?
Yeah, so if you say that we don't want those products, the problem is that the consumer votes with their wallets, and they want these cheap products. But with the way that these Chinese companies work, the low prices they can offer, but also with the subsidizing of the shipping costs and the consumer prices to gain market share, this is very destructive to some local retail players. And those local retail players normally import also from China, mostly in bulk, and then have to pay import taxes. So it's very understandable that a lot of European and US retailers and online retailers are not very happy with the existence of companies like Shein and Temu. Now, on top of that, there's also the area of product safety and product legality and the effect that it can have on the environment. Temu, Shein, and AliExpress all have been known to sometimes ship shoddy goods of low quality that can even be quite dangerous if you have electrical products that could short circuit, that could cause fires and other extremely dangerous situations. So it's very rightfully so and very justified that consumer organizations, but also different governments, are very critical about these companies. Now, one of the things that is happening is that they have decided, both in the US and in Europe, to cancel the so-called de minimis. And the de minimis is a tax exemption of, in the US, $800 and in Europe, €150. If your order stays under that value, you don't have to pay any import tax if you sort of ship it directly to the consumer. This is a rule that was once implemented to make the life of the custom officers a lot easier, so they don't have to inspect every small little package. Now, but because in these times, with the enormous flow of millions or billions of packages that are entering the EU and the US from these platforms, this doesn't really work anymore, of course. So that's why both in the US and in Europe, they've decided to cancel the de minimis. It's already been done in the US in May, the 2nd of May. And they're planning to do this in Europe in 2026, hoping that at least will raise the prices for Temu and Shein and the likes, and sort of take away some of their competitive advantage. I personally have my doubts if that will work, but this is what they are planning to do at the moment, or already have done in the US.
Okay, so we see these efforts to make goods from Temu less attractive. But you have your doubt, and I was wondering, because it sounds quite straightforward that when you have very cheap products filling our markets, and we say it's not good for retailers, it's not good for the environment, then making those goods more expensive via tariff measure, that sounds like a good way to de-incentivize people to buy their stuff. But you say it doesn't work. Could you please tell us why doesn't this work?
Well, for two reasons. I mean, with my work for TechBus China, I'm constantly analyzing what Temu is doing and how they are changing their business model. I've written about 10 in-depth reports since Temu launched. And basically, there's two reasons why I think that it won't have an enormous effect. First of all, it's the enormous price difference. The price difference between goods that Temu offers and when you buy it in a local store is just very large. So even if you start charging import tax, then the products will still be cheaper than local alternatives. Now, take for instance in Europe, if we cancel the de minimis, the tax fee that needs to be paid over a package that is imported from China is between 0 and 17%, depending on the product category of the products in the package. So it could be at most 17% more expensive. Now, what I do is I compare that to the situation that already happened in the US. Now, in the US, at the moment that the de minimis was canceled, the tax fee, the tax tariff was 120% on packages from China. That was because Donald Trump and China were in the middle of a trade war, and they both kept raising their import fees, their import tariffs. And as a result, at the moment of the cancellation of de minimis, it was 120%. That meant that at that moment, Temu completely stopped sending packages from China. They were still sending packages from local warehouses. I'll get to that later. But they stopped sending packages from China because with 120% import tariffs, they could not have the same price advantage anymore compared to local parties. But mid-May, there were new negotiations between the US and China. And the tariffs for packages from China came down to 54%. Now, at TechBus, we had already done research early this year which showed that Temu could probably handle tariffs up to about 50%. And what we saw happening when the tariffs came down from 120% to 45% or 54%, that Temu restarted its business of packages sent from China. So at this tariff rate, 54%, they could still offer products cheaper than Amazon. So that's why I don't think that the extra costs will make a big difference. And the same applies to some ideas from, for instance, from France, where they want to add something like €2 or €5 on every package as sort of an environmental tax. Shein will still be cheaper than other options in the market. So it might cost them a bit of their business, but it won't make them disappear. Now, the second reason why I think that it won't really help all that much if we cancel the de minimis is that Temu has already been anticipating these changes, both the cancellation of the de minimis in the US and in the EU. And what they've started doing since March last year, March 2024, they started implementing what they call a semi-managed model, where they basically say to the merchant, so instead of sending it to our warehouse in Guangdong province in China, you send it to a local warehouse in the target market in the US or in the EU. We'll give you a bit more margin to be able to do that, but you pay for those costs. Well, one of the things that happened is that improves the profitability for Temu, but it also ensures them that by the time that we cancel the de minimis, these goods are in a local warehouse, and with imports into local warehouses, import tax is already being paid over these imports. Now, currently, for instance, in the US, that's about 30%. So they sort of anticipated this, started building up cooperations with local warehouses. They even have some of their own local warehouses. And the aim is that about 80% of all goods that are being shipped in the US, but also in the EU, are being shipped from local warehouses. So the de minimis does not really make a difference anymore because there's already tax being paid over those goods. Now, a couple of additional advantages that they have is they have faster delivery times to the consumers if it comes from local warehouses. So instead of 2 weeks, they can deliver maybe in 3 days, and they can sell all kinds of different products that won't fit in a package in an airplane. So, for instance, they started selling furniture and other very big, bulky products. So we are sort of changing the legislation, but companies like Temu have already anticipated this. A company like Alibaba with AliExpress is basically copying a lot of the same business models. As a matter of fact, the semi-managed model that I just described was invented by AliExpress. So we are sort of working on a solution for a problem that might not even exist anymore because, well, the Chinese players have already anticipated the changing legislation.
So to sum up, you argue that EU policies are too slow to be effective. From a European policymaker standpoint, do you think that it's a lack of understanding for European policymakers, or that they don't have enough tools to do it? What is the way to go? What is effective?
Yeah. So I think indeed the problem is that we are relatively slow with the new legislation in the EU. So if we look at the timeline of Temu, it launched in September 2022 in the US. It came to the EU in April 2023. And at that time, even though I was already warning some retail organizations about this here in the Netherlands, there was very little interest because people thought, oh, this is another Wish or another AliExpress. And there was very little knowledge about the company behind it and what the company Pinduoduo, the parent company, had already done in the domestic market. So there's a lack of knowledge about Chinese players and what they're capable of. Now, it took up until the end of 2023 before I was approached by some journalists to explain Temu And by that time, it had been in the market for more than half a year already. And then what you see in 2024 is a lot of consumer organizations, but also e-commerce, trade organizations starting to complain. So, and then what happens next is that then local governments and the EU government, the European Union, they're starting to take notice and they're starting to make plans. So in 2024, they decided that by 2028, they would cancel the de minimis 4 years later. But at this point, Temu was already basically active for 2 years. So on the one hand, that what happens is that we have not enough knowledge about these Chinese players when they come to our markets. And because of the way the European Union works with basically listening to other organizations that ask them to change the legislation, we are very slow. And when we then decide to change the legislation, these Chinese companies are so incredibly agile that they change their business model before we implement that legislation. Now, it's a good thing that is being done in 2026 instead of the initially planned 2028. But like I said, by this time, the main problem, which was packages from China that don't pay import tax, has already been solved for 80%. Of course, one of the reasons why Temu changed their business model, because they anticipated this. So it's good that we changed the law, but we are sort of trying to solve a problem that has already disappeared largely. Now, I think that we should be much more knowledgeable, both within retail organizations, within the European Union, about what's happening in China, because more and more of these companies are coming our way. We already had AliExpress that's been active for more than 10 years, maybe even 15 years in the European market. Then we had Shein, then we had Temu. You have TikTok Shop has now arrived in some European markets, some of which is selling local brands, but it's also a lot of imported goods again. And then you have Jingdong, JD.com, that has just relaunched Joybuy, also a platform, an online web shop. So more and more of these companies will be coming to our markets because the economy in China is not doing so well. The consumers are not spending as much as 5 years ago. And also in some ways, the market in China is getting saturated. So these companies, I also mentioned Meituan, there's Didi, there's other companies that are already looking abroad, even in different sectors, like in catering, where you have a company like Luckin Coffee that is going abroad and opening stores already in Southeast Asia, but now also in the US. And when they arrive in our markets, we normally are not very knowledgeable about these companies, and especially not about their parent companies. And like I said, we need to be more aware of this and what they are capable of. If you know that a company like Pinduoduo took away 20% market share of Alibaba, you also realize that the same thing could happen in our markets when they arrive here. So on the one hand, we need to be faster in legislation. We need to follow the same speed as these Chinese internet companies. Otherwise, the damage has already been done by the time we change our legislation. Now, another thing, because we've only discussed the tariffs, but we also need to discuss product safety. If there are illegal products on the website. Shein just had a scandal where they were selling child-sized sex dolls on their platform. Not something that they produced themselves, but something that a third party, a merchant, was selling on their marketplace. But they still should be held responsible for what's being sold on their marketplace. Just as companies should be held responsible for polluting products and for unsafe products. Now, we should have legislation, and not just for Chinese companies, for any company that puts dangerous or illegal goods in our market, that has very high punishments. And quite often what you see is if one of those companies gets a fine, that is basically considered to be the cost of business. The fine is being paid, but the sales are already done. So I think that the punishments for such companies should be much harsher and much faster. And something that I always say is that you shouldn't feel sorry about for those platforms, because in their own home market, they they are used to following the sometimes arbitrary legislation and regulation of the Chinese government. And they need to do it very fast, otherwise, they will lose their license and their websites will be blocked or their apps will be blocked. So they can change if they need to. So the thing is that in the EU, we should just have the tools to make them change and make them change faster with faster and harsher regulation. And then, if these companies are following our legislations, following our rules, I think there should be no reason to block them from our markets, because the good thing is that they also stimulate competition within the local markets. And competition is always good for innovation, is at the end of the day always good for the consumer, because they get sometimes better products at lower prices.
Oh, okay, that's a very, very, very interesting point that you raised. So you think the main strength or the most efficient measure against Chinese e-commerce is actually enforcement, and also enforcing way stricter on the quality standards that we already have in Europe. So far, the legal and policy matters. Just for other listeners, retailers, normal folks around there, what should they know about Chinese companies, Chinese e-commerce, before we wrap up?
Yeah. So yeah, normal folks, I think, should also be aware that when they vote with their wallet and they go for the cheap products, for instance on Shein, what the impact of their consumption behavior would be. So I think there should also be campaigns to make them more aware. And then, of course, there's always the question: what will have the biggest impact? Is that the low price of the awareness of consumption behavior? I'm not very optimistic that that consumers will suddenly change their consumption behavior. Now, as for local retailers in the European market, as far as they are concerned, I think they should realize that they probably already know, that they will never win on price. They will never have lower pricings than these Chinese platforms. But what they can do is they can use their own strengths to have faster delivery, to have a higher quality, to have better knowledge about the local consumer, to also have maybe customized products that fit the local taste better. So they should build on their own strengths. But at the same time, they should be aware that as these Chinese companies gain more knowledge about Western consumers, that they will also start building these same advantages and these same strengths. So it's only temporary. Now, like I said, as long as these Chinese companies follow our rules and say have safe products and pay the same taxes as local retailers, I don't think that we should ban them from our markets in a protective measure, because at the end of the day, more competition in the markets just is good for innovation and is also good for high quality and low prices for the consumer at the end of the day. So what we also should do at the same time is that these retailers should get their heads out of the sand and just pay more attention, not just when these companies are coming from China, but learn more about what these companies are already doing in China. And that is something that is very limited. If I, for instance, look at the number of people that take the step here in the Netherlands, where I'm from, to join us on one of the study tours, it is really worrying that very few people do that. I do most of my business now in Germany, where more people are interested in actually going to see what's happening in China. So we have not enough knowledge. We are complacent, and therefore we don't anticipate on all these Chinese companies that are coming to our markets. And when they are in our markets, the only thing we can do is to complain about it and try to have the EU change legislation to push them out of our markets. But that's too late, as we've discussed. So instead of just looking at what is happening as far as innovation is concerned in Silicon Valley, people should be studying what is happening in China, because you can sort of predict what these companies will be doing when they are coming to our markets, and they will be coming to our markets more and more and more often, because the Chinese market is saturated, and they have built up enormous cash reserves, and they will use those cash reserves to capture market share in our markets. So very important, but that's both for legislators and for business people, is they should pay more attention to what's happening in China. Not when these companies are already in your market, but before they actually reach your market.
Okay, thank you very much for your analysis, and we've seen how these companies are extremely innovative. We've seen their flexible business models, and perhaps Europe is too slow in its policy and legislative measures in controlling these flow of goods coming. And finally, said that we should look even more towards China, as a lot of innovation is happening there right now. For any of the listeners interested, Ed regularly updates his blog, TechBus China. Thank you very much for having for being here today. It was very interesting talk. Thank you very much, Ed.